Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last week and 10 days. So these are some great questions that we've been getting, and we think that a lot of the news stories that we'll be alluding to in answering these questions will kind of give you a flavor of why these issues are really important in terms of how we frame international education discussions on our campuses, in our country, at conferences around the world. So as we do each week, to give those who are new to the Roundup a little bit of a refresher, we do take all the themes for our questions from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays, and that's called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And I'm dropping the link to both the online version through MailChimp that you can subscribe to on our SMIE Consulting website, or we've launched also a LinkedIn version of the newsletter that just 2 weeks ago, and it's already gotten over 500 subscribers. Really thanks to everyone who's subscribed to the newsletter and is now sharing this content with their own audiences. It's a great time to be in international education. There's a lot happening around the world, and what we're going to share today are going to be some of the topics that are really defining in a lot of ways the kinds of topics that we're dealing with on our campuses and the issues that we really need to be aware of and in front of as we proceed forward in our day-to-day interactions with our colleagues on campus that might be maybe unaware of some of the global implications of what's going on in other countries and other themes that have been developing over the years. So we do refer to the newsletter quite a bit as we go through the Roundup each week, but I just want to make sure everyone's aware of where you can subscribe to that and make sure you have a copy of the latest version before we get to our midweek roundup on Wednesdays, so we can you can get a chance to maybe anticipate what the 3 themes that we'll be covering are. So let's talk about what those 3 questions we'll be covering today are. First up, how are major destinations countries are recovering from COVID-19? Second, will China ever reopen to international students? And third, do career services offices need to evolve for international students? So we'll talk about these 3 questions and more on today's Midweek Roundup. First question of the day, how are the major destination markets for international students recovering from COVID-19? And obviously the fall of 2021 is the latest intake that we have real data from for all countries. And that really shares a picture across the board that recoveries are underway in various forms. We know in Australia, borders have only just reopened in the latter half of 2021, and it's been a slower than anticipated uptake in new students coming in the spring, but we don't have those numbers in terms of what we're going to be reporting on today. There are 3 articles that I'll be referencing. First up is a fantastic ICEF Monitor article that actually outlines all 4 of the major destinations, Australia, Canada, US, UK, all with detailed examples of and numbers to back it up in terms of what the percentages of students as of this past fall term that were enrolling from around the world to those 4 major destination markets. Some fantastic data. We're going to go through that, but I'll drop the link to that in the comments section on the Facebook page, as well as the other platforms that we're sharing this out across. And again, this is a fairly new format for us on the Roundup. We used to do it just on our Facebook page for SMIE Consulting, but now we're doing it multi-stream across LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, all live at 1 p.m. Eastern every Wednesday. So please do make a note of it. And if you can't subscribe to the live events as we are now, please feel free to download the podcast on any of your major favorite podcast providers, Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, whatever. Wherever you find your podcasts, you'll likely be able to find the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. So, but the ICEF article really is important because I think it gives for my money, the best overview of the major destination markets. Really goes into some detail on the major implications and factors that are affecting demand and travel ability. They make the clear statement that travel restrictions are no longer expected to hamper international student mobility, that demand for study abroad is on the rise post-pandemic. International students are currently deciding where they want to study this coming academic year, and competitor destinations are actively recruiting in priority markets. And that's something that's been very important, I think. You've seen other moves by Canada in terms of their generous post-study work rights and immigration opportunities. Other countries are catching on a little bit and trying to take a bite out of their market share, at least in their favorability ratings for immigration and post-study work. The UK has reinstated their 2-year post-study work rights visa. The US has recently extended OPT, STEM OPT academic programs that qualify for that extra 2 years of work experience. And Australia is also becoming more generous with work rights to recover after nearly 2 years of border closures. So there's a lot going on and a lot of investment by these top 4 destinations in China and India. No surprise there. Interestingly, the ISEF report does break down a few important details by market in terms of where the top 5 source countries for each of the major destinations and how heavily dependent they are on those 5 countries. For example, Australia, 72% of their markets of their students come from their top 5 source markets: China, Nepal, Malaysia, India, and Vietnam. U.S., 61%, so a little bit better diversity there, with China, Korea, Canada, India, Saudi Arabia as the top 5. UK, only 45% are dependent on their top 5: China, US, India, Hong Kong, Italy. And that's primarily because of their proximity to Europe and the pre-existing relationships with most of the EU countries in terms of establishing regular, solid flows of students. Those have decreased post-Brexit, but certainly they're still got some significant diversity built in for them in terms of where their pipelines are coming from. Canada is kind of in between the U.S. and Australia in terms of reliance. There are 66% of university enrollments internationally are dependent on their 5 top sources. And India is their number 1. China is falling as their number 2. Vietnam also falling. France and South Korea are round up the top 5. They do, in the ISEF article, also go in country by country to look at where the biggest growth was in the 4 major markets. For Australia, upticks significantly in Philippines, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Indonesia. Now, these are numbers from their visa numbers for enrollments through December of 2021. Now, we know that the academic year in Australia starts February, March, and that's when the majority of students, January, February, are coming into the country. We reported on the last couple of weeks that there actually haven't been as significant a wave as Australian institutions might have hoped, particularly lags incoming from China, and numbers are down certainly from China anyway, but certainly some decreases are in the number of Indian students, though their overall visa numbers are up, the re-enrolling numbers are down. So there are some issues there for Australia. Canada is seeing some significant decreases in China and Vietnam and South Korea. South Korea has certainly been a declining country for the U.S. for years, but Canada is starting to see that. Vietnam especially, I think Canada, maybe Vietnamese are turning away from Canada a bit and maybe looking back towards the U.S. As a more preferable destination, and some other countries as well in the region, perhaps the UK as well. So we do see a lot of fantastic data in here, and on top of the SEVIS by the numbers report that came out as well, and I'll be dropping the links to both the ICE release of that data, of that SEVIS data, as well as another ISEF report on that, also into the chat. What's interesting about the U.S., and obviously most of our focus here on the Midweek Roundup is taking a look at some of these global trends and importantly U.S. trends from a U.S. perspective, and the implications most directly, because that's obviously the area that I'm most familiar with over my 29 years in the field. But the ICE data certainly reveals the broad strokes of what's happening, and we've seen that data reflect maintain an overall decrease of just under 2%. 1.2% over 2020 in 2021, so there was still a decline. What SEVIS data, and this is where the differences are between SEVIS by the numbers, which is actually as real-time data you can get for international students in the U.S. and as comprehensive as you can get, because it includes F, M's, and J's as well. What is this report actually just includes F's and M's, so the exchanges are probably fairly non-existent from last year anyway. But for apples to apples, it's not the same as Open Doors. Open Doors includes just the respondents to the Open Doors survey, which includes a fair share of those that do enroll in international students in the U.S., but does not include high schools and M programs typically that are exclusively M programs that are more vocational education. So SEVIS does capture the J's, but they're not reported in this report. But the numbers, and it's about as comprehensive as you can get and as real time as you can get. What we're going to see in November from Open Doors through IIE will be reflective of what was enrolled in the United States in the 2020-21 academic year, but they'll report on it the 21-22 academic year, the year that's just finishing. They'll report on that in November of 2022. So that will be a little bit different. But what it will reflect is probably what the ICE report and the ISF Monitor detail article, deep dive into the numbers, does reflect. And that it was, while there was a 1.2% drop overall for a total of 1,236,748 FNMs in the United States in 2021. In 2020-21, we now see, 21, it was an annual report ending for 2021. So what it did show is that the most significant drop was actually in the K through 12 sector. That there were nearly 9,500 fewer K through 12 international students enrolled in the U.S. in 2021. That's a 16% decline. And that's understandable, because most of these students are either in boarding schools or living with host families, most of the international students that are in the U.S. So it's not surprising that there was a decline in those numbers. Parents may be a little bit more reticent to send their kids overseas during a pandemic. Certainly makes sense at the high school age. So what the report also in the ISF Monitor article reflects, that actually we see that though at the high school level, K through 12 sector was down 16%, the higher ed sector was actually up 1.8%. And if I'm not forgetting it, that was very similar to the snapshot survey, maybe a little under the snapshot survey from last fall as to what enrolled fall 2021 in terms of new international enrollments in the fall. So this is obviously total enrollments, so that 1.8% is probably an overall growth that we'll see in new international students for the 2022 Open Doors report that we'll get in November this year. So that's some great data in there. Where the largest growth was on the higher ed side, overall 1.8% up. The highest growth was 6.6% growth in master's degree program students, and that's up over a minus 16% decrease in 2020. So those are certainly significant numbers, and a 6.7% increase in doctoral programs too. So that's very encouraging. Bachelor's programs were fairly stable, a little bit of a decrease, 0.5% of a decrease over 2021. 2020 was where there was a 13% decrease over the year before. So undergraduate internationals make up 38% of total number of international students in higher ed, down from 40%. So grad students are kind of leading the charge back. and then we would expect undergraduates would follow in the next year to 2 years. So some great data in that ISEF Monitor article on the U.S. numbers. So certainly recommend checking all of those out because there's going to be some great data there for you to dig your teeth into. And we could talk for quite a while on what's happening with these numbers, and it seems like every week there's a different source that comes out reflecting another trend in another country or another disaster or another political event or new legislation that impacts an destination's overall appeal to international students. And that's what we try and keep our finger on the pulse on here at the Roundup, is to really dive into some of these trends and see what's perhaps behind them, if this is part of a longer term trend we're seeing, or if it's something that is just a flash in the pan, just yesterday's news by the time we ever get any resolution to it. But certainly I think you're going to see a lot happening in the coming months, a lot of more proactive stances taken by governments to ease the transition for international students, ease the process. And certainly we're seeing that in some of the countries with easing visa processing. And in India, for example, the U.S. is changing the way it will do visa interviews and who's allowed to make those appointments. So we're really seeing some positive energies around this, and governments understanding they need to up their game if they're going to maintain their grip on their market share and hopefully increase. So next topic, will China ever reopen to international students? Now, those who have been with us on the Roundup for a while know that we've talked extensively about what China's done pre-pandemic in terms of making itself a leading destination, frankly, for international students. So not only are they the top sender of students outside their home countries for study overseas, they are one of the top 5 now, or were up to top 3, maybe even top 2 at one point, and in terms of a destination for international students. And a lot of that is on the back of China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, over the past 15 years that has invested hundreds and billions, even trillions of dollars in the developing world for infrastructure projects, for civic projects, for university relations, for scholarship programs, all of that designed to increase China's soft power in the world. And you can see some of that being reflective in what's going on with the conflict in the Ukraine. That's a story for another day. But what we have seen since the pandemic is China has basically curled up into a ball and isn't letting people in. And you can now travel to China for business, but you will be in quarantine for 14 days. Then you're under very strict watch. And in fact, we're going to be sharing State Department's travel advisory for Shanghai in particular, but China in general. It's a travel for advisory. Don't travel to China. They're recommending, U.S. government's been recommending that for weeks now. Actually came out, well, they've updated it. China's now, it was level 4, now it's level 3. But they're calling it because they took everybody off, the CDC took everybody off the level 4 this past week, or just in the last day or so. But they are saying reconsider travel to the People's Republic of China due to arbitrary enforcement of local laws and COVID-19 related restrictions. Do not travel to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region and Shanghai. Do not travel there either due to COVID-19 related restrictions, including the risk of parents and children being separated. So you've probably seen what's happening in Shanghai, and if you haven't, check it out because it's frightening what's going on there. There seems to be, for a number of reasons, China has tried to maintain the zero COVID policy, tolerance policy for COVID, and it's not worked. The Omicron variant that they're dealing with now, Omicron 2 BA, I think it is the BA 2A or 2AB or whichever one it is much more virulent, but it's not as health effects aren't as damaging. They've recorded very few deaths, but who knows how many deaths there actually have been. But they have basically cocooned their population into a bubble for the last 2 years. They have had vaccines that are generally effective, 65% effective, but not as nearly as effective as the Western Moderna, Pfizer versions, Johnson & Johnson. So you see, and they aren't those vaccines aren't as effective against the more recent strands, including Omicron. You've had a trend, though they've vaccinated 1 billion people there, you still have a large number of elderly populations, the most at risk, that refuse to get vaccinated. And they're probably the ones that are going to face the greatest challenges. But you see happening in China, particularly in Shanghai, their largest city, 26 million people, that have been under lockdown in one way. And not when we say lockdowns, it's not U.S. lockdowns. Lockdowns really here, and maybe in some of the larger cities there were some restrictions and police and curfews and such. But it's whole next level stuff in China in terms of what they've been enforcing. In terms of even if you're asymptomatic, you're going to be sent to a quarantine facility that's basically substandard housing. And then extended delays. And if you're trying to travel in China during this, forget about it. It makes it extremely difficult, and it's not a place where you certainly want to be going with family. Again, based on the State Department travel warning, really a negative perspective in terms of what's going on. And for international students that didn't leave, they've been basically under significant monitoring already from the Chinese government, but because of the COVID restrictions, and they've been really limited in terms of their movement in many campuses, restricted to campuses and needing permission to go off campus. And for those that have been trying to get back in, they haven't had any luck in doing that unless you're an NYU Shanghai or Duke Kunshan student, or maybe some of the other British universities that have campuses there. Haven't had any luck in getting back in. And there's also a story out from Study International about the Shanghai lockdown. What does China's relentless zero COVID strategy mean for students? And it talks about the impact of that and on students that have been trying to get back in, on those that are there now. Thanks, John, for being a part of the webinar today. Hope you're enjoying it, and hopefully we get up to see you in Toledo next time you're in town. Thanks for being a part of that conversation. Now, in terms of what's happening in China, there's obviously some impacts long term on what's going on there. We've seen the challenges that China's had in terms of trying to reopen. They've talked about it, but never ever set a date. And there have been students that have been taking their classes online that maybe had left or were trying to get in before the pandemic hit and didn't get in time. And you now see what's happening to a lot of students that have tried to get in from South Asia that have been taking their classes on their phones, on their mobile devices. And they've been doing that for 2 years. And now they still can't get back in to finish their programs. Same thing was happening in Australia. You'd see that happening. So, and paying the tuition rates as if they were in person. So there's a lot of negative damage that's been done to China and their reputation for being a destination for international students, and we'll have a lot of ground to make up when and if they do open again. But as long as they are hanging on this zero COVID tolerance policy, it's not going to happen. International students simply won't be able to return, and you'll see a cratering of their international student enrollments there. If they haven't already, we won't see numbers from them for a while either. So, because it will be negative news. So they don't like to share that with the world. So what's next for China? It's anyone's guess at this point, but it's certainly a return for international students is not happening anytime soon, and certainly recruitment travel there for U.S. institutions, I wouldn't be counting on that anytime soon either. And if you have agents or other third parties on the ground in China, that's probably your best bet to keeping your finger on the pulse of what's going on in that market, because You need that intelligence from somewhere, and if you can't travel there, which you're not going to be anytime soon, realistically, you're going to have to rely on your third-party parties on the ground to help you make the case for your institution. So we'll see what happens down the road, but not looking promising anytime in the next couple of months at least. We'll see how many folks from China come to NAFSA. That'll be an indicator of whether whether they're reopening again in any way to what's happening in the West. So our third and final question of the day: do career services offices need to evolve for international students? Now, many of you who've followed us on the Roundup for a number of weeks or months know that when we talk about international student enrollment in the United States, we talk about it from the perspective of prospect to alumni status. That institutions need to have a holistic approach, not only to just how they admit students, and everybody says they use a holistic approach when they do admit, but the reality is you should be taking that same approach throughout that student's journey on your campus, recognizing that these international students have different needs than your average domestic student or even your average out-of-state student. So it's important to have not just an International Student and Scholar Service office that helps them with the legal and immigration-related concerns that they have, that they need to keep in status throughout their time on campus, but you also have the need for other departments that affect their lives, from academic advising, from housing, from student employment offices, to department offices, to alumni offices, to career services offices that have to have knowledge of the kinds of issues these students are going to be dealing with as they move out into the work world. And throughout their journeys on your campus, there will be things that come up that are slightly off center in terms of it doesn't fit the normal approach you have with dealing with international students. So it requires a different solution. And particularly when it comes to the end product, the outcomes, and we always talk here about how important outcomes are for prospective student audiences and parents, particularly at the undergraduate level, but certainly your grad students for master's and doctoral programs, they want to know outcomes too before they enroll. They want to know what their degree is going to get them and what the possibilities are. They're not necessarily expecting a guaranteed job, but they'll need to know what their chances are to get into certain fields, what their starting salaries might be. Will they be able to work outside the United States? And that is the challenge when we talk about career services evolving. It's not only being aware of the kinds of issues that they deal with on a regular basis in terms of the limitations they might have if they want to do an internship, they have to get it approved as a CPT, a curricular practical training opportunity by their designated school official on campus. And it has to be within or established part of the curriculum for that program to do an internship. And how that's interpreted on different campuses will vary, and that's all well and good. But career services may have a very important role to play with that on your campus if they're working with different departments that regularly have companies from outside hire their students for internships in their junior and senior year. That's something that career services need to be in the loop on what those requirements are, and when they're vetting companies that are coming to campus for internships, for job fairs, for interviews, they need to know or should be capturing in one way or another which companies are willing to hire international students or sponsor students eventually for H-1B. And that's a service international or career services offices can and should provide for their students so that they're aware of and can focus their efforts accordingly on companies that are coming that might want to hire them for an internship or that they can potentially interview for or work for and maybe work overseas for. And that's the other piece of how career services centers can evolve in terms of where students want to work. Not necessarily saying that they're going to be a placement agency for students in various other countries, but they need to be aware of resources that are out there that students can tap into to find out about jobs, not even in just the U.S., but their home countries, maybe a third country where they have an interest in going to work. That's now becoming not an expectation, but certainly if an institution can provide resources to connect students with those kinds of opportunities abroad, they are putting themselves at a much better advantage in terms of convincing that student that you really know what you're doing, and you're an institution that really cares about where they go and what happens next after they leave. The transition from international student to international graduate alumni is a tricky one at most institutions. Most schools don't capture international alumni data. They might have relied on third-party tools like Handshake and other opportunities that Minds LinkedIn for connections with other with alumni of your institution. There's a lot of that content that is out there now, but connecting with alumni networks, providing services for that group, that's something that Career Services can work with alumni on, and in developing that specifically for international students. So there's a lot more that we could talk about on this Career Services issue, but certainly a lot that I think most of us who are in the field realize is a much larger conversation, and one that's not going to be solved today. But certainly we thank you for spending the time live with us here on our Midweek Roundup here at Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thanks to those who have been watching on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Glad to have somebody connecting on all those platforms today to check out the Roundup. So until next time, we wish you all the very best, and we'll see you around the way.